All right, there we go. Yeah, thank you so much for making time again.
Yeah.
Let me make sure I have my little mini fail-safe. How's your night going?
I've had a good day because I've got the first draft of a big project done.
Oh, nice.
You know how that is.
And you're doing that is that why you're in California? Is this project?
Not really, but it happened to happen while I was here. I'm here for my daughter just had her first baby, so
Oh, congratulations.
yeah, not my first grandchild, but her first baby. So yeah, it's nice. It's a nice break from grey London, you know.
I was gonna say it's probably nicer in California than it is in London right now.
Oh Lord, yes, quite on numerous levels.
Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you. I guess like one thing that I really want to include in this thing is sort of your like you have kind of this 5-point system of what constitutes a cult, and this
Yeah.
is it seems like it's to me it seems like the easiest way to understand this stuff. Like even I feel like people get confused by the bite model. Like your system is really simple and to the point, and it was read or it was given to the January 6th Commission to explain that what was happening with Trump like bore some resemblance or was a cult event. Like Donald Trump
Yeah.
was behaving like a cult leader.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could just run through those points.
Yeah. And just to say, several of us scholars in this area have these different models, and I think they all have something to add,
Yeah, they complement each other,
Yeah, they very much do. We're all looking at the same elephant, so to speak. We're taking different approaches, but we're all fully agreed on what this thing is. So anyway,
Yeah.
but the model I use, which is largely based on Lifton and Hannah Arendt and a couple other people, including myself. So I look at a 5-point model for how we can determine if something's a cult, or kind of what are the things you need to make a cult, if that should be your interest in life. So the first point is that the leadership, and the leadership of a cult has 2 characteristics. They're charismatic, kind of obviously, they have to have some appeal to people. But the one that doesn't get talked about so much is that they're also authoritarian. Mm-hmm. So you get what I kind of think of as a charismatic bully. Sorry, today
no, it's fine.
A bit of a cough, so hopefully it's nothing serious, but you'll have to.
Authoritarian, like in all cases, though, right? Like there's never.
All cult leaders are authoritarian. If they weren't, they wouldn't make these horrible systems.
Mm-hmm.
They would make benign systems. There are charismatic people who are not authoritarian. I would argue that Obama and Mandela were both examples of that, and I'm sure there's many, many others. Mm-hmm. But you get the ones who combine that ability to appeal to people with this kind of psychopathic need to control others is kind of what really the bottom line is. Then you get this formula for a cult leader. So that's the leadership. The second element that I talk about is the structure that these leaders create. And they either do it kind of intuitively, or they learn it, as children because they've grown up in similar environments, or they've been through other cults and kind of figured, oh, I could do a good job at that, and decide to start their own. So the key elements of the structure of these organizations is that they are isolating, they're very hierarchical in that the leader calls all the shots, basically. Mm-hmm. They're closed, except for kind of the larger organizations will have front groups around the edges, which are used to bring people in or bring resources in. And so they're often, the larger ones are shaped kind of like the layers of an onion. And the further in you go, the crazier and more controlling it is. So people may encounter a cult on the outside edges, you know, maybe they go to a yoga studio or something, and it may seem pretty normal to them. But the experience of, say, the teachers, like as in hot yoga, Bikram yoga, I should say, starts to get very controlled. So you have the isolating hierarchical closed structure. Then you have the structure of the belief system itself, or of the ideology that the cult is promoting. And really, you know, we see that cults have endless different kinds of belief systems, left and right, and Christian and Hindu and Muslim and Jewish and UFO and business, therapy. I mean, you can't, endless. You can't come up with enough varieties, you know. So it's clearly, in a way, not the content as such of the beliefs. It's what I think of as the structure of the belief system. And that is really reflecting the structure of the organization. So the belief system is also isolating. It says you can only believe this and nothing else. We've got you covered for everything by our belief system. You need go nowhere else. It justifies the preeminence of the leader, because the leader is the final authority on what those beliefs are. And it kind of says, you know, like a lot of these leaders will say they heard directly from God, and that's why they're saying these things, or from, you know, Karl Marx or whoever it might be, right? I speak as a halfway still Marxist, so that's not a slight on Marx. But yeah, they have a special connection, which gives them the right to say what the beliefs are. Also, the beliefs are very kind of by nature sort of confusing and contradictory often. And the way that they are delivered can be very confusing. So it kind of adds to this fourth process of brainwashing or coercive control, in that it's the beliefs themselves and the way they're delivered can be quite dissociating, because they're not true. They're not reflecting any actual reality that people are experiencing once you get further into the group. So the fourth point is there's the process that the group engages in. And I refer to that as brainwashing, but there's lots of other words you can use. And that relies on, well, the simplest way I can explain it is it's a fear-based process. So you have this group that's isolated you. It says it's the best thing since sliced bread, and this is, you know, heavenly and great and wonderful. And you're kind of engulfed in that system. But at the same time, and this is really critical, it's sending fear messages to followers in a very constant kind of way. Either, you know, the immigrants are going to take over, or Armageddon's coming, whatever it might be, but this kind of constant drumbeat of anxiety and fear. And by the way, you yourself as a follower have all these deficits that need to be criticized and transformed. So it's kind of the external fear, and also this kind of projecting that onto people individually, and often direct punishment and violence as well. So the supposedly good place, which you're kind of belonging to because you think it's good, is actually causing you what I call chronic relational stress.
And you might be like afraid of the outside, like the outside world, and not realize that like what is making you afraid of it is like your environment. Even it might seem safe, but well, not being safe.
Exactly. That's the essential contradiction. And we see, yeah, that a person or a group is saying it's safe, but it's actually very unsafe. And it's the same dynamic we see in controlling domestic violence, you know, with the boyfriend bringing the bunch of flowers, I love you, darling, and, you know, a lot of attention. And then suddenly and unpredictably, you might get beaten up. And then the next day, they're really sorry. I really didn't mean to do that. I really do love you. It's that alternating, as the title of my book, that alternating terror and love dynamic in an isolating environment. If people weren't isolated, they could kind of go off to someone outside the system and say, this is kind of crazy making, what's happening here? And that person might advise them, get out. But once you're isolated, you kind of have nowhere to go, and you have to cognitively know where to go. It becomes very difficult to think about that relationship.
Yeah, and I think something on that point is like you'll see in like a domestic violence situation where, you know, some woman shows up, she's wearing her sunglasses or whatever to work or whatever, like as a black eye. And she's in this like isolating system where, and she's hearing, you know, I'm so sorry, I love you, blah, blah. And her friend or coworker or something might be like, oh my God, like you need to, like might talk some sense into like a crazy situation. But then like you go home or you go back to the cult or whatever, and it's like right back into the cycle. He's got flowers and everything. And whatever you just heard, whatever positive message you received, like can be dissuaded. And it seems like that happens like in cults as well.
Well, also you have to think that not only are people isolated, but their housing, very possibly their job, their family might all be in the system. So to leave, they may be leaving everything that their life depends on. And in fact, it's extremely difficult to leave a cult for that very reason, because you have to reestablish yourself in the outside world with kind of often no resources. So let me just go to the fifth point, because that was, yeah, that fourth point is in a way the most complicated one and is worth digging into. But why do cult leaders do this? Well, they do it, I think, psychologically for their own benefit, to control their environment, that they're psychologically, that makes them feel safe to control other people. But they also then get what I refer to as fringe benefits from that control. So they might, if they're so inclined, get sexual favors by exploiting people in the cult. They may often get financial rewards by exploiting people in the cult, free labor, and any other resources they can get.
Yeah, and sometimes it gets really extreme where like everything you mentioned and more is going the way of leadership, who maybe doles out like a little bit of that to the people beneath them, and then there's, you know, the people at the bottom get nothing or whatever. I mean,
and this is all in the name of the great cause. So the leader isn't saying, give me your wife, give me your money, give everything. They're saying, you know, for your transformation and the great cause, whatever that might be, this is the right thing to do. Give, you know, your children. I mean, I've just done a whole piece of work where parents abandoned their children because the leader would say, you're going to put all your neuroses on your children, and they're too special to be, you know, ruined by the parents' neuroses. So you must essentially, you know, separate from them. And when you're in this, you know, what cults do is they disable people's critical thinking. One might have been a critical thinker, more or less, but when you get into these systems, that becomes disabled through this chronic fear that I talked about. It just starts to, it's not so much that it makes sense, it's that it's easier to do what you're told. You know, you're exhausted, you're confused, You don't have any escape hatch. And even though it may feel funny, you may do things that, in fact, you certainly will do things that you would not do prior to joining the cult.
Yeah.
That's why we worry about cults, because people become the kind of agents of the cult leader's madness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's never like, I guess it's rarely like the cult leader themselves that does something like violent in public or whatever. It's these agents that you talk about. I mean, and you see this, I guess, in a lot of different where like extreme things happen. Like it's never going to be like, unless it's like a suicide thing, like it's not going to be something where there's going to be blood on the cult leader's hands. Like I think about that with the body. Like I'm not really worried about the cult leader. It's his underlings that I think about. And I guess like I wanted to say, like, because you talked about abandoning children, and that's like some of your research, your recent research, and that's something that I feel like is, to me, the family separation and abandoning of children is something that in this particular story is pretty extreme. I mean, it happens it's not like it's like unique or anything, but I mean, you have just situations where, there's one woman who left her 6 children. Her youngest was a 2-year-old in 2015, and she hasn't seen him since. She's still in the cult. There's another woman who gave birth to a baby and never held the baby, and she just got out, and eventually those kids were rescued earlier this year. But these situations, I mean, you just, I'm not a mother, I'm not a parent, but I understand the sort of bond as a person.
As a child
As a child, that you just can't imagine these types of situations, or they, like somebody making that decision on their own. And I feel like that's kind of an important thing for people to understand when they think about control. It's like, this is how extreme it is. These people, this one woman, she was a housewife. Like all she did was raise her children, and now like she doesn't talk to her children and hasn't seen them. Like she wouldn't even recognize her like 9-year-old at this point. And yeah, I guess like if there's anything you could offer as far as insight into that's really curious to me, especially if you've been researching it recently.
Well, interestingly, I mean, I've come full circle, because my very first piece of research was on mothers and cults. My first and in between, because one of the things I've really focused on in my work is this pattern you see in cults, and it's, I would say, a predictor of whether something is a cult or not, is this separation of people from their close relationships. This is, I mean, as soon as you see that, you have to get out your big warning flags and say, this doesn't look like a healthy organization. So because I think all cults do a version of that, which is break up couples who are too close, or put different people together with other people, which I believe the body does. Interfere consistently between the parent and the child, whether or not it's abandoning the child, at least getting in between that relationship, and it's the leader that's making the decisions about child rearing. And so you always see some versions of this. And I think the reason why it's done, first of all, that doesn't happen right at the beginning. You have to get people to a point where you can do that to them.
No, you couldn't say like you're gonna join us, and we're not no kids allowed or something like that.
Yeah. You have to kind of, so to speak, groom people or radicalize people. Any of these words, they all kind of mean the same, to get to that point where you've got enough control. But to maintain that control, you need to cut people off from any trusting or caring relationships. And that's really the great magic of how cults work, if I can call it that, but evil magic, bad magic. Because we are social animals, and we deal with, in our world, based on relationships and based on close relationships. And in fact, if we're completely isolated from close relationships, that's another element that makes it really hard for us to think clearly. We're not getting feedback from people we trust. And also we're not, with children, like a parent to a child, that's more what we call the caregiving system. And, someone who's still attached to their child in a proper way is going to leave if that relationship is threatened. So you have to to keep that person really solidly in the group, you've got to weaken that relationship. Because, like for instance, a mother's survival instinct will usually be also about protecting her child.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of break that. And cult leaders are very skilled at doing that. Like the example I gave of, your child is so special, they're destined for great things, and you're just in the way of that. So really the best thing you can do for your child is to leave them with some, whoever else,
Yeah.
that can make a certain kind of sense at a certain point if you're far enough down the road. And
Well,
then once that's done, you've taken another step even further down that road, if you see it. So it kind of becomes a feedback loop.
And I guess this wasn't something like you became a mother in a cult.
I did.
And it wasn't like you were talking to your husband one day and were like, yeah, I think maybe we should have some kids. Like this was something that was kind of dictated, like it's time to like reproduce. So there was never any like you weren't separated from your children, but you had that experience of motherhood in an authoritarian, like controlling environment.
Yeah, and I, for instance, sent my kids to a really crappy daycare center. I mean, it wasn't as bad as abandoning a kid, but it's not the kind of place I would have, because it was the cult daycare center.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of things I didn't like about it, and I wouldn't have done that in my non-cult self.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I had been involved with the group. I can't quite remember it so long ago now, but I think at least a year before I got this directive that it was time to have children.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was already deep into the secrecy and so forth. So I couldn't discuss that with my old friends. Anyway, I'd been isolated, to put it briefly. And for me, I was fortunate because I had various things happen. That is kind of a long story and I won't go into it, but at the point where they did start to try to control my relationship with my children more intensely, that kind of set a light bulb off in my head. And that was one of the elements that helped me get out. It's like, no, my son shall have free play. He shall be able to choose to play with Ninja Turtles.
Yeah, I think you talk about that in your book. Like there was like a no make-believe policy or something. I can't remember.
Kids were supposed to be sort of productive, and that time we got this long criticism, supposedly based on dialectical materialist principles. I mean, I can laugh about it now, and at that point I was not it's hard to say. There were a lot of, it's a complicated answer because there were a lot of other things happening, including the leader happened to be in jail at the time, though we didn't know it. But it meant things were a little bit looser generally. The isolation wasn't quite as intense. So, and we weren't as busy, so we had a little time to think. So, you don't want to give people breathing space, but we had a little breathing space. And in that, I was able to go, this is bullshit. I'm not going to raise my kids like this. This is horrible. And I could start finding my way out, which was an exquisitely difficult process, by the way.
How was this is just like a question out of curiosity. How, I assume you still got like memos, right? When he was in jail?
No, I mean, that was what was odd, is that
okay.
having been very controlled with these crazy memos, then things kind of went quiet, and we kind of had to, I mean, that was part of the problem, is we had to start making decisions for ourselves. So for instance, at that time, my now ex-husband and I were running a computer business, which was part of the whole cult thing. A lot of cults run computer businesses, interestingly. And we would send off a memo, you know, well, what should we do now? And then nothing would come back. And we would have these really long, serious discussions saying, well, you know, what are we supposed to do now? And guess what? We would have to start thinking about what the next step was. So that's what I mean about, don't give people space to do that. You know, keep telling them.
No, if you're a cult leader, you don't want people to think. And you talked about this last week too, about, you know, a guy who had access to a computer. Like, you're not supposed to give people access to the internet all the time. You're a cult leader, because like, people are gonna look into stuff that you don't want them to look into. So yeah, I mean, just like any sort of like the free thinking, and I guess I see this all the time in the body too, where it's like, I guess I don't see the mechanisms of how like it actually works, but you see the results when they come out like publicly and say something or speak to a newspaper or whatever they do. Just this like the level of bullshit. Like the denial, I mean, I guess like a situation that like this thing that I'm making is, a lot of it is about this court case, because there's all this audio from the actual court case, and all these people get up there and lie for the cult. Like, when you were, I don't know if this is something that I know the answer to, is like, did you ever have to lie for the cult?
Totally, all the time. For a start, one had to lie to one's family. I lied to my family. They didn't, you know, the whole organization in my case was secret. So, you know, so no one knew that I was in an organization for a start. I would, you know, when I got into this kind of arranged marriage and suddenly was going to have kids, I just came, I can't remember what I said, but I came, you know, it wasn't saying, well, I've been told to do this. So your whole life was a lie in a way. And then I had, I mean, the biggest lie, which I talk about in my book, was at some point the FBI came to our door. And, you know, I was underground revolutionary. I knew the FBI weren't good, you know, on my side. And this guy knocked on the door and I said, who is it? And by the way, at that stage, no one was supposed to come to our houses. That's part of the isolation. And this guy said, FBI, and I wouldn't talk to him. And he said, well, you'd talk to me if you knew there'd been a murder in this house, which I didn't know, but it turns out that was my dear, the great leaders doing. Anyway, so it's kind of a ridiculous story if it wasn't so sad. Anyway, after this happened, I wouldn't let the guy in. And I called my contact, you know, a level up in the hierarchy, and said what had happened. And she later got back to me. She obviously went up her layers. And this was when, by the way, the leader was on the run from this crime, which I certainly knew nothing about at all. Anyway, I was then told that I should go to my doctor and say that I'd had this visit from the FBI, and it had so traumatized me that I needed treatment for my mental ill health and trauma. Right?
Yeah.
I did that. I went to the doctor. I mean, I'm not a liar. You know, I try to be pretty honest mostly in my life, as honest as any of us are. And I went to the doctor and kind of method acted this story that I was so upset by this whole thing that he had to give me some kind of treatment for mental health problems. Now, I can't tell you why I was told to do that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what's the benefit for Theo or I don't know.
Yeah, I have absolutely no idea. I suppose maybe it was I mean, I don't know, but I still, even though that happened, I was told there was a murder. I kind of, and a lot of times people talk about this, I pushed it to the back of my mind. I couldn't kind of fathom what this was all about. And instead of using my quite considerable intellectual capacity that I have, I just was like, cannot compute, too difficult, push it back. And this is the experience of someone who's brainwashed, okay? It's not that none of it, it's not that you don't notice these weird things. It's that that process means you don't have the capacity to think about them in your frontal cortex. And that's because of fear, because to think about it, this is like when you try and talk to someone who's in a cult and you try to say, hey, you're in a cult. They can't engage in that conversation because to think about the cult is itself frightening, even though they won't be able to name that. But that's the psychological process that has happened, is to make them too frightened to even look at that relationship.
Do you think, like, had you called this friend and they talked to leadership or whatever, got back to you and said, hey, next time these people show up, this is the story you're going to tell, and it was something just like totally bogus, like, how would you have reacted? I mean, I guess like you have to think of like how you would have reacted as like all this time ago, but do you have any perspective on?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I mean, I'm
asking, like, if somebody told you to tell a lie,
yeah,
and was like, this is beneficial for it, even if it was crazy.
Yeah.
Like in this case, like there's this woman.
It was crazy. That what I did by my standards was crazy. So I don't have any trouble understanding that.
I guess like in this case, like I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happened in court, or just people being dishonest in amazing ways. But the big thing at the center of it is that this woman is saying, like, my husband is a pedophile. He's saying my wife is in a cult. That's the whole basis of what's going on, what happened in court. And she tells stories in court of like all the kids are wetting the bed. Like, I mean, it's really clever. Like, the husband was like jerking off babies. I mean, it's just outrageous. But I mean, in a custody case, like, this stuff has to be considered. And I just wonder, like, man, like, and this is the same woman, hasn't seen her kids in 7 years or whatever. One of them was a 2-year-old. She dropped her off in the driveway, never came back. I just think about like what it would take to, I mean, I know what it would take, but it's just like that level of control. And I mean, it's hard to have like perspective on such a like individual, like, unique situation, but I think like you've probably heard something similar to it before. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of like people in cults like calling people pedophiles, because that's
it's a frequent accusation. Yeah,
and for a purpose. Like, it's like kind of the worst thing you could say about somebody.
I mean, this just kind of brings to mind all the false memory stuff that happened, that's kind of slowed down now, where under influence of therapists, particularly women, were remembering these kind of stories that supposedly happened to them, even if there was absolutely zero evidence. And they'd never remembered it for 30 years. And suddenly they go to this one therapist, and all their therapist clients are starting to remember terrible abuse that generally in the story their fathers visited on them. So we know that people can be manipulated to say things. And then I guess the thing in a cult that would be added or different is that you're protecting the great cause. I mean, if you were protecting people from going off to Auschwitz, you would lie for that.
Yeah, you'd do anything.
So
say anything.
So you have that as the quote ideological or belief justification, right? And then you have the inability to think critically, And then you have the fear that's unnamed. It's very hard to explain that. So the person doesn't know they're afraid of the cult, but their body knows. So when you're living in chronic trauma, you have chronic arousal of your cortisol system. So you're in this kind of state of hypervigilance all the time, but you may attribute it to something else, like you're not good enough, or, you know, the enemy is at the gates or whatever. So you have all these things working together, where to say so-and-so's a pedophile just seems like that's the thing to do.
Yeah, and that, you know, the person you're calling a pedophile, like there might be an enemy of God, you know.
Exactly. I mean, I remember sort of my breaking point when I went from a possible recruit to a cult member. And it was a strange experience, you know. So I'd been in this highly stressful situation for several weeks in this particular phase of my entry into this group. And I was exhausted, and I was lonely, and I had no one to talk to, and I was generally getting kind of criticized, and I was walking on eggshells for everything I did. And my brain just got so confused. And I just remember that feeling of like, I think I'm going to have a nervous breakdown, is kind of what I thought was going to happen to me. It was like, and, you know, I have mental illness in my family, so I had very vivid pictures of what that looks like. So, you know, I didn't want to have a nervous breakdown. That was really a scary thing to me. But I really felt they'd messed with my head so well and so much at that point, that it was like, oh, what can I do to like get back my center, my well-being? And the answer I had was to join the group fully. And then I felt this kind of relief. So that submission, they kind of get you so upset that the submission to go along with it feels like a relief. Oh, I don't have to try to figure this out anymore. They know better. They can tell me what to do. It's not because I'm the kind of person who wants to be told what to do, rather the opposite. I'm rather ultra independent. But I got into that place where it was too difficult to do otherwise.